is my piece after I added on all of my two-tone shadows. So here's my shadows layer. So this also has some gradients in it for this guy, but mostly this is just two-tone shadows. So you can see here, I added in some darker values on the trees, shadows here in the foreground on the rocks and the character. And this can be close to done here, basically. Like everything should be pretty much figured out at this point. And anything else I'm going to put in here is kind of just like icing on the cake, very small finishing touches, but it's not going to overly change the composition as a whole as of right now. So yeah, one of those last little icing on the cake things that I'm going to do is add in some highlights. So I'm going to make a new layer. Usually I put this highlights layer underneath my shadows layer. Okay. So now what I can do is switch to a brush tool. And I usually, I've mentioned in the previous videos, I usually like to add textures with a little bit of highlights or a little bit of text. I like to add highlights that have a little bit of texture. So as you guys saw for adding the shadows, I would go in, select a color, select the rocks, go to my shadows layer, select that color of the rocks, and then create my the color for the shadows. For highlights, you don't need to go in and adjust your highlight color for every shape. I know that generally the kind of light that's shining on this scene is a very golden, orangish kind of color. So I can now just use this color on all the objects. Since it's the same type of light hitting all of these objects, I can just use that one color. I'll switch back to my brush tool, and I want the opacity really low when adding highlights. Usually between 5 and 10 somewhere should work okay. And again, the texture, it can get looking too smooth if you don't have a texture in there. So I'm just going to start going in here and just adding in texture on these, or highlights on these different shapes. But it's also adding some of that texture, which is nice. I don't want real bold highlights that are like really standing out too much. I want to keep them pretty subtle. That's just basically because this isn't under direct sunlight. So if this was like a scene in the middle of the day, or the scene where maybe someone's on stage or something like that, or has a bright spotlight on, that's when I would want really bright, bold highlights on there. But these can be more subtle. Okay, and again, more in the foreground, more highlights on your focal point. Will kind of be your goal there. Just made my brush a little smaller to add in on these smaller shapes. All right, so that's starting to look good here in the foreground. Again, subtle, subtle, subtle is the key with these. This is not going to make, you cannot fix a drawing by adding highlights on it. You should have a good drawing already figured out, and then later on, that good drawing, you're just adding, highlights to kind of help make a few things pop, draw attention to certain things. I am going to select the water here. I'm going to see what this looks like. This may take a few tries, but I want to get some that golden oranges in the water. So as I'm looking at it here, yeah, right above those tree lines, there's that brighter value. And then we can get, this one has a nice, really like saturated band of orange in there. All right, so I'm going to try and put some highlights right by the reflection of these trees. Maybe it's slightly more orangey. Okay. So as you see, I'm doing that, but the reflection of these trees are on my shadows layer. Oh, so I just got to be below that layer. That's the only thing. There we go. Now I can add some of these highlights in there. And I know I want to, the old man is my focal point. So I want to put some highlights right around him and keep it subtle everywhere else. So that's why I'm putting a little more of those highlights right there, right around his face. And the texture here in the water really works nice. It kind of makes it feel like it's glistening from the sun a little bit. Helps to put a little bit of movement in that water as well. Nice. Yeah. It's looking pretty good. Okay. Yeah, so that's looking pretty good. I'm going to go in and add a few more little ones in a few other places. And what I do at the very last step is I'll go on top of everything. So on top of the ink work, on top of the shadows. I usually just call that a top paint layer, and I just do that for any little things I want to add in that I haven't yet. So I add a few more layers or a few more highlights, and then also one more layer on top. And then you guys, I will send you this around to kind of use as an example for the project. I'll put it all together in a PDF for you to see. But this is kind of the overall process that I use for creating these illustrations. But it is going to be very important to really follow those steps closely as you're working, and then kind of at the end you can break free of those steps and just add some paint on the very top layer. But other than that, try and follow those steps as closely as possible as you're working.